Hi, Gina.
Hey, Jason.
So today we have our visiting artist for the spring 2022 semester, Gina Hunt, who's a local Chicago artist, and we're really excited to have her work here. So thanks for watching, Gina.
Thank you. Yes, hi, I'm Gina. Welcome to the solo exhibition Spectrum up here at Harper College. I'd like to start the talk by introducing myself a little bit with my background, as well as reviewing a bit about my artistic practice and the things that really compel me and interest me that we'll be able to highlight in specific pieces throughout the show during this short talk. So to begin, I grew up in South Dakota, which is a place with a very expansive landscape, and have realized more recently that the constant presence of the sun and atmospheric conditions are really in my bodily memory and have become very present in the work in kind of indirect, but at this point pretty direct ways as well. Being from that landscape, it's very flat, upper Midwest, Great Plains, full of incredibly colorful, saturated sunsets and sunrises, continues to direct my fascinations with light, color, perception, and the vitality and really importance of direct observation, of witnessing change through time. My artistic practice is focused on histories of abstraction, really including vernacular traditions such as patterning found in decoration, architecture, and textiles, human vision and color theory, optical phenomena caused by atmospheric conditions and sunlight, which we'll see later, and a lot of craft-based traditions that are very manual, as in with really using your hands, such as woodworking and quilting. Alongside, of course, also my ever-continuing educational background in painting and art history. Those are specific areas of focus that are synthesized throughout the entire process of creating the work. From the references which provoke the imagery, the color choices that are really important, the composition, and then to the actual production of the artwork in its completion. I use many processes to create each painting in the show, and I'll be able to describe some of these aspects to you in selected works. The show is called Spectrum, which is a word used to describe the spaces between and across borders, delineations, categories. It's really a range, it's not singular nor definitive. The word is really important for how people describe themselves in terms of their identities, their politics, and it's also been used for hundreds of years to describe and encapsulate, an attempt to encapsulate the uncountable number of colors that humans are capable of perceiving, that is, everything within the visible light spectrum. I'm interested in these spaces that exist between names, categories, and the slippery spaces within nomenclature. All of these things are very relevant in really direct but also metaphorical ways to the work in this show. Also, the paintings in this show span about 6 years of time, really highlighting multiple bodies of work. So the title reflects this range of time, of work, and research as well. I'd like to highlight a few pieces that are in the show to describe how process and production is really informed by location that the work is made, and also my fascination with vision, dependent on where the work is produced, and of course then under the conditions of which it's produced and viewed, with an acknowledgement that perception, observation, viewing experience are all subjective experiences dependent on many factors inside and outside of an individual. The visual appearance of the completed works is determined by, of course, their physical and material facts, but just as integral is the point of view of who is observing the work, which I hope you'll be able to get a glimpse of in this talk as we move about the show and get different points of view of some of the pieces here. I'd like to start talking about this painting, which is the oldest painting in the show, Flit. It was produced in 2015 during a really intense and forever ongoing questioning of material possibilities, within painting, within its historical traditions, and containing innovations. I was really diving into the physical facts of painting with this work. How can process inform image, what it's going to look like in the end? And what can process carry in terms of the work's content? And I was diving into all of these questions in a really intense and personal way through making this painting. I think it might be helpful for me to point towards some really early influences of mine that became incredibly influential years before this painting was made anyways. And that would be talking about post-minimalism as a huge influence to me since I started studying art. Because of material choices and their flexibility, their malleability, and even their mortality, their flux, their shift, their change. All of these things I found incredibly valuable when studying the work of post-minimalist artists, especially someone like Eva Hesse, whose work is really implicating the body and ideas of mortality, and also very process-based as well. So to make this piece, it was incredibly manual and very laborious, and involved a lot of things that I learned from two people in particular. And so just prior to making this painting, I took a break from the studio. I was having a lot of frustrations in there that related to illusion, materiality, the kind of physicalness of painting, and wanting to really push the objectness, the physicality, and the material facts of painting, but I wasn't quite sure how that could play out at all. So I left my studio for a while and visited my grandmother, and we worked on making a quilt. I immediately thought about my studio and the paintings that I was really frustrated by while making this quilt with my grandmother. We were pulling together pieces of cotton, stitching them, cutting them, putting back together, measuring them, aligning them, making geometric patterns. Everything that we were doing reminded me of things I had learned from art history, like mid-20th century geometric abstraction. It was super relevant to what I was doing with my grandmother, but the traditions of quilting and the traditions of geometric abstraction in the 20th century US have very different places within history. And that was really meaningful and problematic for me in a really productive kind of way. So I got back to my studio and had this pile of canvases beneath my studio table that I thought were failed paintings, so I started cutting them all up. I did that for a while, and then started piecing them together in the ways that my grandmother taught me while we were making a quilt. So that's what led to the making of this painting, Flit. The painting was made by cutting up prepared gessoed canvas, and then weaving the strips of material onto my studio wall, attaching it, and then spraying translucent layers of cyan, magenta, and yellow paint, which are the primary colors within print processes, and then unweaving, reweaving a new pattern, and spraying it again, doing this multiple times, really reflective of that process that my grandmother showed me of putting something together and then taking it apart and putting it together again in different patterns to create something that you can barely imagine while you're making it. So it's really full of surprise at the end. I'm really enamored by quick, fleeting movement of light, which is what this title reflects. And so this painting actually is made of woven pieces of canvases. Moving to another set of paintings that were really pivotal for me. There are 3 of them here from a series I made called Liquid Crystal plus Polymer. I produced these paintings during a year-long fellowship in Doha, Qatar, following my graduate studies. I was immediately completely absorbed by the opportunity to live within Islamic architecture, historical as well as contemporary, by living in Doha and traveling to nearby places in the Middle East. I actually studied Islamic art and architecture during the time that I got my BFA, so being able to kind of circle back to those studies by living within this specific kind of architecture was incredibly meaningful and very formative throughout this work, but continuing at this time still. I was studying architecture's role as a mediator between sunlight and its ever-changing levels of severity, especially at that part of the world that's very close to the equator. the architecture and the geometric patterning within the architectural spaces has a very specific function, and that is to filter and mediate light and its severity in that part of the world. And that had a lot of conceptual potential for me. And so I thought about that really directly when considering how to make paintings after moving across the world. So I was studying architecture's role as mediator between sunlight and noticing that I could really study light as a way to read time and observe time through change and through flickering, through watching and observing highlights and shadows through these mediations like architecture. I was working with materials that were available to me from the place where I was living. So I was using textiles, specifically in these paintings that were being sold to wear on the body, and I used these to make paintings. So these paintings are made through layers of a synthetic material that is sort of a mesh because of the cutout patterns seen within it. I then soaked the material in paint, kind of give it a bit more integrity, so then I could actually make paintings with this fabric that's supposed to be worn on the body. There's an architectural feature throughout Qatar that is very traditional within Islamic architecture called the Matrabia. And the Matrabia filters and mediates light, like I was mentioning earlier, and it has geometric cutout patterns allowing light to pass through or to block it. These paintings were directly influenced by the Matrabia. So you can see the cutout pattern and the stacks and layers of this screen. For me, is very much drawing from and referencing the Matrabia scene throughout so much of the architecture surrounding me at that time. So I was finding this relationship between architecture as a filter and then noticing a similarity to digital screens. Both filter and emit light to the eye and the body. And these filters and mediators of information, specifically then within digital screens, use the additive primaries of light, red, green, and blue. And so that became my focus for investigating color within these paintings, are focusing on those additive primaries of red, green, and blue. So each of these paintings only has those three colors, and exactly those three colors. And the sort of method I set up to create these was to switch the order of layering of color through each of these works to find how many possibilities there were for that resulting image by switching that choice of layering the color. Something that I find really productive but completely fascinating also is working within limitations. So working within only three colors, the same materials, but making one decision that is different, which is the layering of the color, allowed me to see the possibilities that were generated through those very specific yet limited choices. And these are the works that resulted from that. I've become really interested in creating interference patterns as well. It's interference patterns, something that's found throughout nature, found through waves in water, found through sound waves. It's essentially an identical pattern that's overlapped yet offset and creates an emergent pattern. So identical pattern 1 and 2 on top of one another yet slightly offset creates this new emergent pattern. And that's something that I find to be incredibly exciting, and it was very visible and kind of pushed this work and the decisions that I made with it. So there's this animated kind of flicker that happens when observing these paintings, even though they are objects that are physical and stable and not moving, yet there is an animated quality to them because of that interference pattern that's created. Moving on to this painting here, this is called Twinned Arcs, which is a title that references optical phenomena caused by light under specific atmospheric conditions, another area of research that I find completely inspiring. This is one of the more recent works in the show. Recently, over the last year or two, I've been studying hyperspectral imaging and sourcing the color palettes assigned to imaging formats and sources. I have a long-standing interest with technologies of imaging going back to the invention of photography, and this current source of imaging, hyperspectral, it's scanning wavelengths observed within a single pixel of an object of a material through a camera that scans. So it's observing way beyond red, green, and blue, which is what our eyes are observing. and really actually even goes beyond the visible light spectrum with the amount of light information it's able to scan. I find that incredibly fascinating because it's a way of producing an image that is beyond what is actually observable by human eyes. The colors are assigned somewhat arbitrarily by the physicist who is scanning whatever material it might be. They're always hypersaturated colors though, and they're seen on a digital screen, so they're made of light. Those colors are even made of light. And so this painting in particular is very much referencing in its color palette hyperspectral imaging and that high saturation of that kind of imaging. I'm really fascinated by hyperspectral imaging, and like I said, it comes from a long-term fascination with imaging in general, producing images of something we believe in and we understand is there, and we understand the facts about it, but we can't see it. And this goes back to the invention of photography even. Trying to create an image of something you believe to be there, and you know it's there, and you understand it to an extent, however you cannot see it. And hyperspectral imaging is now the sort of very current kind of imaging that is doing that is going beyond the visible light spectrum to create images of that which we cannot see. Moving forward to the most recent work in the show will be this site-responsive installation within the windows. I felt so lucky to have the opportunity to create a site-responsive installation and have it exist along with the paintings in the show. It's an opportunity that I haven't quite been able to get yet. I've done a lot of site-responsive installations within the landscape, within architectural spaces, but I have not had the opportunity for those installations to live alongside the paintings. And so it's really wonderful to be able to see this exist alongside the paintings as well. You can see that this is made of, this installation is about 15 feet tall by 11 feet wide. It's made of this scrim mesh material. It's a PVC coated scrim. And you'll notice that it has these cutout patterns. And I'd like to circle back to one of the inspirations I mentioned earlier, which is the Matrabia. It continues to inspire me, that architectural feature found within Qatar where I was living. This still is very much a reflection of the Matrabia and how it's filtering and mediating light and pushing it into an architectural space through geometric patterning. Also, because of the nature of the scrim material, the interference pattern is also very present. It's very intentional of me to do. I'm very fascinated by this scrim material's conceptual possibility. It's used in theater quite a bit. As a backdrop, it has a lot of possibilities and potential with creating illusions of space and depth dependent on the light source. I like to put this material within windows because it's ever changing, it's constantly changing, it's never looking the same. And that's something that I do in the paintings, even though they're not changing at all, even if they're hanging on a wall. But in a piece like this, it's always kind of flickering and changing depending on the sunlight, of course, the atmospheric conditions from outside, and then also the point of view of the viewer standing in front of the piece or next to it. So it's always in flux. This material is used to cover facades during periods of transition and construction. It is also a material that gives the illusion of floating, glowing color. The layering of the cutout shapes creates an emergent pattern which cannot be predicted until the work is installed on site, and I find that to be incredibly exciting. I'll make all sorts of plans, drawings. I worked on this for so many months, and in the end, I could imagine what it looked like, but having it being actually installed on site this is the first time I've been able to see it, is when it's actually installed, and I find that really exciting. So the emergent pattern is, of course, dependent on its individual parts in each layer, yet it's really unique and greater than the sum of its parts. The cutout pattern that I've used within this installation came about by many months of making drawings after doing a lot of research on a particular kind of wave that's found in light as well as water. And there's a lot of new research coming out with this specific kind of wave in light. It's a wave that has been observed in water for over 100 years. It's a soliton wave. Its energy continues, and it's singular, and it does not disperse like other waves. And I found that to be incredibly fascinating and really unique. So this kind of wave was recently discovered to also be present in light. From there, I kept digging into this because I just found it really fascinating that this was also found in light. And so then the pattern that I settled on after many drawings was influenced and really inspired by the collision of two soliton waves in light. So two soliton waves in light colliding and actually then creating an interference pattern, which really blew my mind. It sort of was a full circle to all of these kind of questions and use of pattern and interference through material that I've been doing for years. To be able to see imaging from physicists that was done just over the past year and have them observe interference patterns through these light waves colliding, it made a lot of sense to me, but I found it to be completely inspiring, but also validating for where the work is going. And then specifically within this piece, that is, of course, illuminated by light. So the cutout, where there are cutouts and no material behind, we only see the light, which also is a very direct reference to these soliton waves. I've used this material before in outdoor installations and sculptures within landscape and architecture, and this is the first time I've brought it indoors directly. And I'm really looking forward to continuing to explore its possibilities, especially at this scale in future works, bringing these materials even closer in relationship to architecture and direct sunlight.